In the heart of a bustling city, in a mansion so big it almost seemed like a small palace, lived a billionaire unlike anyone else. He was a man of immense wealth, the kind of person who could buy anything he wanted with a snap of his fingers, yet money had not softened him. In fact, it had made him more demanding, more impatient, and far more difficult to please. People said he had everything in the world, but in truth, he had very little when it came to simple happiness. His staff lived in constant fear of angering him because even the smallest mistake could set off a storm of frustration. They whispered about his sharp temper and impossible standards, about how no one had ever managed to truly satisfy him, and about the long list of maids who had come and gone, leaving in tears or sheer exhaustion. Despite his reputation, there was something undeniably magnetic about him. His presence commanded attention wherever he went. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who had fought his way to the top and wanted the world to know it. But behind the sharp suits, the tall walls, and the rare smiles, there was a side of him almost no one saw, a side shaped by loneliness and years of self-reliance. He had learned to trust no one but himself, and it showed in the way he ran his household. Every corner of his mansion reflected precision, every room told a story of control and order, yet behind that order was a deep-seated frustration that no one could ever seem to calm. Visitors rarely stayed long because the atmosphere in the house was tense. Even business associates felt the weight of his strict personality. Staff who had worked in other billionaire homes thought they knew what it took to manage a wealthy household, but they quickly discovered that this was unlike any other home. Tasks that seemed simple, like arranging flowers, cooking a meal, or cleaning a room, suddenly became monumental challenges when judged by his exacting standards. He had rules for everything, and woe to anyone who broke them, even by accident. Friends of the billionaire often described him as brilliant but unapproachable. They admired his intelligence and sharp instincts but admitted that living with him, or even spending a day in his presence, required nerves of steel. He was the kind of man who expected perfection in everything, not out of arrogance alone, but because he believed it was the only way to maintain control over a life that had been hard-earned. There was a vulnerability hidden behind that demanding exterior, though very few ever saw it. He feared being let down, feared losing control, and feared that people would see him as ordinary or flawed, which is why he kept everyone at a distance. As days passed, the mansion became almost a symbol of his solitude. Rooms were filled with luxury, crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors, and artwork worth millions, but there was little warmth. The walls echoed with the footsteps of staff who hurried to avoid mistakes, and the air was thick with tension. The billionaire's life seemed perfect on the surface, yet it was empty in ways money could never fill. His anger, so often described as furious by those who dared work for him, was not random cruelty, it was a shield, a way to maintain control in a world he could not entirely trust. Every morning, he would wake early, reviewing his schedule, making phone calls, and checking every detail of his life, leaving little room for errors or surprises. Staff members who tried to help often ended up frustrated, not because the tasks were impossible, but because nothing they did ever seemed to be good enough. And so, one by one, they left. The mansion saw maids come and go like the changing of the seasons, each one convinced they could handle him, each one leaving with a story of their failure. But despite all this, there was a strange curiosity about the billionaire. Outsiders wondered if anyone could ever break through his walls, if someone could find the patience, courage, or cleverness to manage the impossible. Little did anyone know, a very unexpected person was about to arrive, someone small, young, and underestimated, who would not only face his fury but would change everything about the life of the hardest man anyone had ever known. After the last maid had left in frustration, the billionaire's mansion fell into a quiet chaos. The house, with all its grandeur, suddenly felt emptier and colder than ever. Dishes were left in the sink, beds went unmade, and even the chandeliers seemed to collect dust without anyone to polish them. The billionaire paced through his vast home, his temper simmering, muttering about how no one could handle even the simplest tasks. Friends and associates had warned him that hiring someone new might only bring another disappointment, but he refused to let his pride show. He needed help, and he would try again. The next maid arrived on a bright Monday morning, her posture straight, eyes filled with determination, and a clipboard in hand. She was experienced, confident, and ready to prove that she could finally meet the impossible standards of the infamous billionaire. For a moment, she felt a thrill at the challenge, imagining herself conquering the most difficult household in the city. But the moment she stepped into the mansion, she felt the weight of unspoken rules pressing down on her. Every corner of the house seemed to watch her, every hallway echoing with invisible expectations. The billionaire observed her from a distance, his sharp eyes assessing every movement. He didn't greet her with kindness, he didn't smile. He simply waited, his patience thin, as if daring her to fail. And fail she did, in ways she hadn't expected. A simple arrangement of the silverware was deemed uneven, a vase slightly off-center sparked an unexpected storm, and her carefully folded towels seemed to irritate him more than anything else. The first day ended with the maid holding back tears, wondering how anyone could live up to such impossible standards. By the next morning, she quietly left, saying she had realized she could not meet the billionaire's expectations. This pattern repeated itself over and over again. Maids came, each confident they would succeed where the others had failed, and each left frustrated, exhausted, or on the verge of tears. Some tried to rush through the tasks, only to find that speed was not enough. Some tried to please him with charm, only to discover that charm had no place in this house. Every failure seemed to fuel the billionaire's anger even more. Yet, deep inside, he wasn't cruel. He only wanted someone who could understand the way he lived, someone who could manage his home without making him feel like he was losing control. As the weeks passed, the mansion became a quiet battlefield. The staff who remained whispered stories about the furious billionaire, warning each new maid to tread lightly. They shared tales of misplaced items, sudden outbursts, and impossible expectations. Some had given up entirely, leaving jobs in other homes simply to avoid the challenge of this mansion. Yet the billionaire continued his search. He refused to compromise, unwilling to accept less than perfection, and unwilling to admit that perhaps the problem was not with the maids, but with his own rigidity. In the midst of this tension, the mansion remained a stunning place of luxury. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above marble floors, the aroma of exotic flowers filled the air, and rooms gleamed with the shine of wealth. But behind the beauty, chaos brewed quietly, invisible to those outside the mansion's walls. The billionaire's frustration was like an undercurrent, affecting everyone who entered. His staff lived in a delicate balance of fear, respect, and cautious hope that they might finally succeed where others had failed. It was during this period of repeated failures that the story began to take a turn. The mansion, though orderly in appearance, was filled with tension, waiting for someone to finally change the rhythm of life within its walls. Unbeknownst to the billionaire, and to the maids who had tried and failed, the arrival of one unlikely helper would soon disrupt everything. Unlike the professional maids who left in despair, this new helper would not be measured by experience or fear. She would challenge expectations in ways no one had imagined. And in doing so, she would begin to turn the mansion, and its furious owner, upside down. Just when the mansion had grown used to the routine of failed maids and quiet frustration, a new presence quietly appeared at the door. Unlike the previous maids, this one was small, almost fragile-looking, with big curious eyes and a mischievous smile that seemed to notice everything at once. No one expected much from her. She wasn't formally trained, didn't carry a clipboard, and had no years of experience listed on a resume. To the staff, she seemed like a child playing dress-up, completely out of place in a mansion filled with wealth, rules, and fear. But the little girl had something the others did not, a spark of confidence and courage that could not be measured by age or experience. She didn't flinch when the towering doors opened to greet her, nor did she shrink at the sight of the billionaire, sitting in his usual chair, his eyes sharp and suspicious, as if measuring whether she was just another doomed attempt. She simply smiled, a quiet, fearless smile that immediately made the staff whisper to each other in disbelief. "She's going to fail too," one muttered. "No one survives a day in this house," said another. Yet the little girl did not hear them. She didn't even seem to care. Her first steps inside the mansion were careful, yet filled with curiosity. She observed everything, the way the chandeliers hung like frozen stars, the polished floors reflecting the sunlight, and the subtle tension that hung in the air. Unlike the previous maids, she didn't rush to act or try to impress anyone. She walked slowly, noticing small details that everyone else overlooked: a crooked picture frame, a slightly dusty shelf, a vase that needed water. Her eyes seemed to understand the mansion, not as a place of fear, but as a puzzle waiting to be solved. When she finally met the billionaire face to face, something unexpected happened. He raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed, expecting the same mistakes he had seen so many times before. He even gave her a sharp, testing glance, almost daring her to fail. But she didn't flinch. Instead, she looked at him calmly, with no fear, no hesitation, and a quiet confidence that seemed almost impossible for someone her age. There was a boldness in her gaze, a kind of courage that made even the billionaire pause for a fraction of a second. That pause, though tiny, was enough to plant the first seed of change. Her first task was simple, something any maid could have done in minutes, but the billionaire's standards made it nearly impossible. The little girl studied the room, thought for a moment, and then started working in her own way. She didn't follow the rigid rules that had trapped others, she found her own method. Slowly, carefully, she arranged the furniture, polished the surfaces, and tidied up the room. And when she finished, she stepped back and smiled, as if daring the billionaire to find a fault. For the first time in weeks, the billionaire didn't explode. He walked around the room, scrutinizing every corner, every detail. His sharp eyes moved slowly, almost suspiciously, yet no complaint came. Something about the little girl's work felt different. It wasn't perfect in the traditional sense, but it was thoughtful, clever, and somehow better than the sterile perfection he had demanded before. He felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation, a flicker of curiosity, maybe even admiration. The staff, who had been quietly watching from the shadows, exchanged amazed glances. Could it really be possible? Could this tiny, inexperienced girl actually succeed where the strongest, most experienced maids had failed? They whispered in disbelief, some shaking their heads, others holding their breath, as the mansion itself seemed to settle slightly, almost as if it had been waiting for this moment. By the end of her first day, the little girl hadn't just completed her tasks, she had changed the energy of the house. The fear that had dominated the staff began to soften, replaced by a cautious hope. Even the billionaire, for all his fury and strictness, found himself watching her, wondering what made this little girl different. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't desperate to impress. She was simply herself, clever, observant, and brave, and for the first time, someone in the mansion seemed able to face the impossible, and maybe even win. And so, the stage was set. The little girl had arrived, and with her presence, the mansion and its furious owner were about to experience a story no one could have imagined. She was small, underestimated, and untrained, but her courage, intelligence, and heart would soon prove that sometimes, the most unlikely person can achieve the impossible. The little girl had only been in the mansion a few hours, yet she already felt the weight of the billionaire's gaze. It was a look that could unsettle even the most seasoned adults, sharp, calculating, and filled with silent judgment. He didn't say a word at first. He simply watched as she moved around the room with quiet confidence, her small hands working with precision, her eyes always scanning for the next task. Most people would have crumbled under such scrutiny, but she didn't. She seemed to absorb his stare like a puzzle, not a threat. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and firm, carrying the authority of a man used to being obeyed. "Do you know what I expect in this house?" he asked, though the question felt more like a warning. She looked up at him, tilting her head slightly, and nodded. "Yes," she said calmly, "I'll do my best." The billionaire had expected hesitation, maybe fear, but instead, she spoke with a certainty that made him pause. It wasn't arrogance, exactly, it was something far rarer, quiet confidence paired with understanding. He decided to test her. He assigned her a simple but precise task, something that had caused previous maids to break under pressure. It wasn't the difficulty of the task that mattered, it was the expectation of perfection, the invisible rules no one could fully understand. As she moved through the task, he observed every motion, every decision she made, his brow furrowed in concentration. Each time she did something correctly, he barely acknowledged it, but when she made a small mistake, his lips tightened, and for a moment, his eyes flashed with that familiar fury. Most adults would have panicked under such a reaction, but the little girl did something remarkable. She didn't flinch, she didn't apologize excessively, and she certainly didn't cry. She simply corrected the mistake calmly and continued, as if saying without words, "I am here to do this, and I am capable." For the first time in weeks, the billionaire felt a strange sense of intrigue. He had expected fear, and instead, he found determination. The staff, who had been quietly watching from a distance, couldn't believe what they were seeing. The little girl was handling the billionaire in a way no one had ever managed before. She didn't try to flatter him or guess what he wanted, she simply observed, learned, and acted. Her natural intelligence and careful attention to detail shone in a way that no experience or training could teach. She was, in every sense, remarkable. As the day went on, their interactions grew more interesting. The billionaire began to ask questions, not to scold, not to trap her, but to understand how she thought. "Why did you place the vase there?" he asked, expecting a weak answer, but she explained her reasoning clearly and simply. The location allowed the sunlight to highlight the flowers, and it balanced the room visually. The billionaire's sharp eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in astonishment. She wasn't guessing, she was thinking. By the afternoon, a subtle shift began to take place. The billionaire, known for his anger and impatience, found himself speaking more calmly. He corrected her where necessary, but his words lacked the usual sharpness. Instead, there was a sense of curiosity in the way he watched her work. He realized that he had underestimated her, not because of her age or size, but because he had never encountered someone who refused to be intimidated by him. For the little girl, the encounter was challenging but invigorating. She understood the stakes. This was not just about cleaning or organizing, it was about proving that even the smallest and most underestimated person could stand up to someone who seemed unstoppable. And though she did not yet know it, the billionaire himself was being tested. He was learning patience, a concept foreign to him, because this little girl did not react to his fury in the expected ways. By evening, the billionaire made a quiet observation. No maid had ever stayed composed, attentive, and thoughtful under his scrutiny. Yet this little girl had. Her first encounter with him had not only survived his fury but had also softened it, just a little. The mansion, which had been heavy with tension for months, felt lighter, as if her courage had pushed back the shadows that hung over it. And so, their first real encounter ended, not with anger or failure, but with an unspoken understanding. The billionaire had met someone who might, just might, be capable of achieving the impossible. And the little girl had discovered that even the most intimidating person could be approached with calm, cleverness, and courage. Neither of them knew it yet, but this meeting marked the beginning of a story that would change both their lives forever. From the very first day, it was clear that the little girl was not like anyone else who had tried to work in the mansion, but the true test was only beginning. The billionaire had an unspoken list of impossible tasks, things that no maid had ever completed to his satisfaction. Some were simple in appearance, like cleaning the study or arranging the silverware, but each required precision, patience, and intuition, qualities the billionaire had long assumed were impossible to find in anyone, especially a child. The first challenge came when he asked her to organize his private library, a room that was more than just bookshelves. It was a labyrinth of rare collections, personal notes, and priceless manuscripts. Previous maids had approached it with strict rules and lists, panicking as they tried to balance perfection with speed. The billionaire expected her to make mistakes, to fumble or freeze under the pressure. But she did something no one had done before. She observed first. She ran her fingers along the spines of the books, noticing the titles, the order, and the subtle differences in size and color. She didn't rush. She didn't panic. She simply worked with a calm, deliberate focus that amazed even the staff who were quietly watching from the hallway. By the end of the hour, the library looked perfect, not in the cold, rigid way the billionaire had imagined, but in a way that made sense. Every book had its place, every shelf looked balanced, and the room felt alive, as though it had been waiting for someone to care for it properly. The billionaire walked in, expecting to find errors, but he found none. Instead, he found something he hadn't anticipated: thoughtfulness. The way she had arranged the books reflected understanding, not blind obedience, and that small difference made him pause. Next came the kitchen, where the billionaire had witnessed many failed attempts to prepare a simple meal. Most maids either rushed through it or overcomplicated it, making mistakes that set him off immediately. The little girl, however, approached it differently. She asked questions, observed the ingredients, and even noticed small details like the placement of knives and the freshness of herbs. When she cooked, it wasn't just about following a recipe, it was about understanding the flow, anticipating what was needed next, and adjusting before mistakes happened. By the time the meal was served, it looked perfect, tasted amazing, and required no corrections. The billionaire, who had expected frustration, felt a small spark of admiration, though he would never admit it aloud. The day's final task was the most impossible of all: preparing the guest rooms for a sudden visit. These rooms had been the downfall of countless maids before her. Sheets had to be perfectly folded, furniture aligned exactly, and personal items arranged just right. While others had approached it mechanically, she treated it like a puzzle, thinking through each step carefully. She corrected herself silently, adjusted without complaint, and worked faster than anyone expected, without sacrificing care or detail. By evening, every room in the mansion gleamed in a way that had never been seen before. The billionaire walked through the halls, inspecting, pointing out tiny details that had been wrong before, and realizing, to his quiet astonishment, that this little girl had exceeded expectations. Not only had she completed the tasks, but she had done so in a way that showed intelligence, creativity, and understanding. She had taken what seemed impossible and made it achievable, not by following strict rules, but by thinking, observing, and acting with courage. Even the staff, who had grown cynical from months of failed attempts, were amazed. Whispers filled the hallways. "She did it," one said. "She actually did it," another replied. For the first time in a long while, the mansion felt alive with possibility rather than tense with fear. The billionaire, known for his fury and strict standards, sat quietly in his study that night, reflecting on the day. He realized something important: it wasn't about finding someone to blindly obey him. It was about finding someone who could understand, anticipate, and act with intelligence and heart. The little girl had done what no one else could, and in doing so, she had begun to transform the mansion, and him, without even trying to impress. And so, the impossible had been tackled, not with fear, not with obedience, but with courage, cleverness, and patience. The little girl had proven something remarkable: that no matter how strict, angry, or demanding someone might be, there is always a way to rise above expectations, and sometimes, the smallest person can achieve the greatest victories. As days turned into weeks, the little girl's presence in the mansion began to shift the atmosphere in ways no one could have predicted. The billionaire, once known for his fury and impossibly high standards, started noticing subtle changes in himself. At first, he didn't acknowledge them, because pride and habit were hard to break. But quietly, almost imperceptibly, he began to soften. It was in the way he allowed her a little more freedom to complete tasks her way, in the moments he paused before correcting her, and in the rare, almost unnoticed hints of curiosity in his eyes. The little girl, for her part, remained focused but unafraid. She had learned to read the billionaire, not just his moods but the patterns behind them. She noticed that anger often came from frustration, not cruelty, and she learned to anticipate it. When he was tense, she approached gently; when he was impatient, she worked efficiently and quietly. She didn't try to change him, she simply understood him. And that understanding began to break through the walls he had built around himself. It was during a particularly busy week that the first real breakthrough occurred. A large event was scheduled at the mansion, requiring the entire household to be immaculate. Every room had to shine, every table set perfectly, and every detail considered. The previous staff would have panicked at such an impossible task, but the little girl approached it with calm determination. She organized teams, delegated tasks, and even solved small problems before anyone else noticed them. The billionaire watched in disbelief as she transformed chaos into order, all while keeping a serene smile on her face. For the first time, he didn't bark commands or scold anyone. Instead, he observed. And as he observed, he began to feel something unfamiliar: respect. The little girl wasn't just a maid or a helper, she was clever, brave, and resourceful. She had learned the language of the mansion, the unspoken rules, and the invisible standards, and she was navigating them better than anyone had ever done. Over the next few days, the billionaire's behavior continued to shift. He started speaking with her, not just giving orders, but asking questions. "Why did you do it this way?" he would ask, genuinely curious about her methods. And she would answer simply and confidently, explaining her reasoning in ways that were easy to understand but impossible to dismiss. Each explanation revealed her thoughtfulness and intelligence, and with every answer, the billionaire's respect grew. The staff began to notice too. The fear that had dominated the mansion for months started to fade. They saw the little girl not just surviving under his scrutiny, but thriving. She was changing the rules without even trying, teaching the billionaire a lesson he hadn't realized he needed: patience, understanding, and trust could achieve more than anger and control ever could. Then came a day that truly tested the barriers between them. A sudden problem arose in the mansion, a minor disaster, perhaps, but one that could have caused chaos and stress. Previous maids would have panicked, staff would have frozen. But the little girl remained calm. She took charge, identified the issue, and solved it quickly, all while keeping the billionaire informed of her actions. He watched, initially skeptical, then astonished, as she managed what no adult had been able to handle. In that moment, a barrier broke, not just in his mind about what a child could do, but in his perception of control, authority, and trust. From that day on, their relationship changed. The billionaire began to rely on her judgment, to seek her advice in small matters, and even to smile quietly at her clever solutions. He started seeing her not as a subordinate, but as someone capable, resourceful, and extraordinary. And the little girl, who had never sought recognition or power, continued to prove that courage, intelligence, and patience could overcome even the most rigid walls. By the end of this chapter of their story, it was clear to everyone in the mansion that something remarkable had happened. The once furious billionaire had softened, not through force or persuasion, but through the quiet, steady persistence of a small, brave girl. She had broken barriers of anger, fear, and mistrust, and in doing so, had begun to change not only the mansion but the man who ruled it. The impossible was no longer impossible, because the little girl had shown that sometimes understanding, cleverness, and courage can achieve what anger and wealth never could. The turning point came on a day that began like any other in the mansion, yet it would become unforgettable. A crisis struck suddenly. One of the billionaire's most prized possessions, a rare and fragile artwork, had been accidentally knocked over during the morning cleaning. Panic spread through the staff instantly. The previous maids would have fled in fear, some in tears, some frozen, knowing that no mistake in this mansion was ever forgiven. But the little girl did not panic. She simply observed the scene calmly, assessing the damage, her mind already working on a solution while others were paralyzed with fear. The billionaire arrived shortly after the accident, his face pale with anger and disbelief. Rarely had he felt so frustrated and helpless. He stormed into the room, his eyes scanning the damage, expecting to explode at the staff for their carelessness. Yet the little girl stepped forward calmly, her small hand steady, her voice soft but clear. "I can fix this," she said. There was no hesitation, no fear, only determination. For a moment, the billionaire's fury almost overcame him, but something in her tone made him pause. She examined the artwork carefully. She knew it was delicate and that one wrong move could ruin it entirely. With precise, careful motions, she began to stabilize it, using the skills she had learned from observation and practice. She worked quietly, her concentration absolute, while the billionaire watched in astonishment. He had never seen anyone handle a crisis like this, not his staff, not his assistants, not even adults he had trained himself. Yet here was a small girl, seemingly fragile, managing the impossible with courage and intelligence. Minutes passed like hours. Every movement mattered, every adjustment had to be perfect. The billionaire, for the first time, felt his pulse slow instead of quicken. He was no longer thinking about anger or punishment. He was watching, silently, as the little girl turned a potential disaster into a careful rescue. Slowly, she restored the artwork, ensuring it was secure and unharmed. The room, which had been tense with fear moments ago, now felt like it had exhaled, the crisis diffused by her steady hands and clever thinking. The staff could hardly believe it. They watched in awe, realizing that the little girl had done what no one else could. She had solved a problem that had terrified even seasoned adults, all without panic, complaints, or hesitation. And the billionaire, well, he was speechless. His usual sharp words, his furious outbursts, his rigid standards, all of them faded in that moment, replaced by something he hadn't felt in years, admiration, respect, and even a hint of gratitude. After the incident, the atmosphere in the mansion changed dramatically. The billionaire no longer viewed the little girl as just another helper. She had earned something far greater than compliance, she had earned his trust. He began consulting her on small decisions, asking her opinion on matters both big and small. Every time she offered a solution, it was thoughtful, precise, and often more effective than anything he could have imagined. For the first time, he felt that someone could truly understand him, not by obeying blindly, but by thinking independently and acting courageously. The little girl, for her part, did not let the success go to her head. She remained humble, focused on her tasks, and quietly determined to continue helping the mansion run smoothly. Yet she had proven something profound: courage, intelligence, and calmness under pressure could change even the hardest hearts. The billionaire had faced countless staff who feared him, but none had ever faced him with the quiet strength she displayed. And in doing so, she had not only solved a crisis but had begun to change him as well. By the evening, the mansion was no longer just a place of luxury and tension, it was a place of possibility. The billionaire began to realize that the little girl's presence was not just convenient, it was transformative. She had turned fear into respect, chaos into order, and fury into admiration. In that single, decisive day, she had accomplished what no adult had ever managed. She had achieved the impossible and, in the process, changed the man who had believed nothing and no one could ever match his standards. And so, the turning point was complete. The little girl was no longer just a helper. She had become an irreplaceable presence in the mansion, a quiet force of courage, cleverness, and heart. And the billionaire, for the first time in years, began to see the world differently, through her eyes, with patience, respect, and a recognition that greatness can come in the most unexpected forms. The mansion had never felt quieter, yet the air was full of a new kind of energy, one of respect, trust, and an unexpected warmth. The little girl had become more than just a helper, she had become a presence that the billionaire could no longer ignore, someone whose intelligence, courage, and patience had quietly transformed the household. The once furious man who had ruled his mansion with fear and strictness now moved through the rooms with less tension, his sharp edges softened by the understanding and trust the little girl had earned. It was a slow transformation, not sudden or dramatic, but steady, like sunlight gradually filling a dark room. The billionaire began to notice small things, how she anticipated what needed to be done without being asked, how she spoke to the staff with kindness while still commanding respect, and how her calmness seemed to ripple through the house. Even the staff who had once feared him now moved with confidence, inspired by her example. The mansion, which had once been a place of tension and stress, had become a place of possibility, where even the impossible seemed achievable. The little girl, in her quiet and unassuming way, had also changed the billionaire himself. He began to laugh more freely, speak less sharply, and show patience he had long believed he did not possess. The fury that had defined him was replaced, slowly, by a sense of appreciation for someone who could face him without fear and handle challenges no one else could. He realized that he had spent years trying to control everything and everyone around him, yet it had taken a small, brave girl to show him the true meaning of trust, respect, and humility. One afternoon, as they walked through the mansion together, the billionaire paused and looked at her. For the first time, he didn't see her as small or inexperienced. He saw her as capable, remarkable, and irreplaceable. "You've done what no one else could," he said quietly, almost in awe. The little girl smiled, but she didn't boast. She simply nodded, knowing that her work wasn't about recognition, it was about making a difference, even in ways that others might not notice. The legacy of her presence went beyond the mansion itself. She had taught the billionaire that strength isn't about fear, wealth, or control, it's about understanding, courage, and kindness. She had shown him that the impossible could be achieved not through dominance, but through patience, cleverness, and a willingness to see the world differently. The mansion was no longer just a symbol of his wealth, it was a testament to what one small person could accomplish when faced with a challenge. Even the staff felt the change. The air of fear that had hung over the mansion for so long had lifted. They worked with confidence, inspired by the little girl's example, and even the billionaire began to consult them in small ways, showing a respect for their ideas he had never considered before. It was a transformation that no one had expected but everyone felt. In the end, the little girl had not only survived the fury of the billionaire, she had reshaped it. She had turned anger into respect, frustration into admiration, and fear into trust. The mansion, once a place of tension and strict rules, had become a home filled with possibility and hope. The billionaire himself was no longer the same man who had once believed no one could meet his impossible standards. He had learned, through patience and observation, that courage and intelligence could come in the smallest and most unexpected forms. And so, the story of the little girl and the furious billionaire became a tale that would be remembered, not for wealth, not for power, but for the extraordinary impact one determined, brave, and clever person could have on a life that seemed untouchable. She had achieved the impossible, not by force, not by obedience, but by being herself, resilient, intelligent, and courageous. And in doing so, she left a legacy that would forever change the mansion, the billionaire, and everyone who witnessed her remarkable journey. The impossible had been done, not through fear or wealth, but through heart, courage, and the quiet brilliance of a little girl who refused to be intimidated, proving that sometimes, the smallest person can make the greatest difference.